Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. This month of May is a special one in the Theravada Buddhist tradition, as many of you probably know. About 2 weeks ago or so, on the full moon, we celebrated Wesak, we celebrated the birth, enlightenment, and passing into Parinibbana, the death of the Buddha. And so I think I'm still glowing from the beauty of that, and still enjoying the recollection of the Buddha. And in particular, there's one sutta that always strikes me from the stories of the Buddha's life in the Pali Canon. And it's a sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya, from the Middle Length Discourses, in which Ananda, his attendant, Venerable Ananda, is recounting some of the wondrous things that happened leading up to the Buddha's birth and at the time of the Buddha's birth. And he talks about the special way in which Mahamaya was feeling at the time, and that the Buddha was born from her side, and that there was light and there was water, warm and cold water, and there were earthquakes. There were all kinds of wondrous lotuses springing up under his feet, and so on. All kinds of wondrous signs. And then Ananda's recounting these things, and the Buddha says to him, yes, that's so, but please also remember that one wondrous quality of the Tathagata is that the Tathagata knows a feeling tone when it arises, when it's present, and when it goes away. And a Tathagata knows a perception, a sanya, a perception when it arises, when it's present, and when it goes away. And a Tathagata knows a thought when it arises, when it's present, and when it passes away. Equally wondrous. In fact, Bhikkhu Bodhi, in his translation of this sutta, puts a little footnote right there. And he says that he believes that the Buddha states this as the most wondrous of the things that are listed in the sutta. And it is indeed wondrous, that ability. And I also believe that in the Buddha's compassion, he mentions it because it's also something that is available to us. So we are experiencing those same processes as human beings. We're built that way. And yet, at a time like this, when things are happening in the world as they are, and things are happening in our personal lives as they are, perhaps one of the most difficult things that we experience is that we're faced with our minds. We're faced with our own minds. And we're faced, to some extent, with what we see in the minds of others, the folks that we live with, even public figures. I have to say, sometimes that's pretty scary. So we are faced with our own minds and with the perceptions and the thoughts and the feeling tones. But perhaps our task is to find a skillful ability to be present with them. Our task is really to know that process in a kind of intimacy and with a kind of skill that it reveals something about the nature of reality that we might not ordinarily experience without that investigation. So, of course, over the course of years after the Buddha's enlightenment, he spent decades wandering India and teaching. And in that process, he offered us a lot of different frameworks. He offered us many different ways. Sometimes we can relate to them as lists or groupings or categories. But actually, what I'm going to propose tonight and the thread that I hope to draw this evening is that the Buddha offered us a variety of frameworks for taking this whole mass of a human life, of the experience that we have in mind and body, this thing that we are so entangled with, and actually being able to focus on different characteristics of it, different aspects of it, such that we might be able to digest, we might be able to get really close with it. See actually where we live, so to speak, in our inner world, in our bodies, and in the way that those things are interacting with the environment. So one of the frameworks that the Buddha gave that he mentions in what is currently understood as the second discourse after his awakening, the Anattalakkhana Sutta, or the Sutta on non-self. The Buddha describes a human life in terms of a framework called the five khandhas. It describes the human experience as the five khandhas. And those are rupa, the bodily form, and things that come from bodily form, like tears or waste or sweat. And vedana, which is feeling tone. Feeling tone is really, I think of it sometimes as associated with the primitive mind. It's a very, very, it's even a pre-verbal kind of sense of something as either pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. And by neutral, we mean neither of them, sort of indeterminate, something in the middle. So we can think of it as a continuum with things that are excruciatingly difficult at one end, and then these kind of neutral experiences in the middle, and then things which are extremely pleasant, very blissful, perhaps like the most blissful of the meditative states. And then there is sanya. So sanya is perception, the way that we identify a thing as a thing. Often it has a word associated with it. So if you hear a sound, you might think plane. Or if your first language was Spanish, you would think avión. And then sankhara. Sankhara are more complex thoughts associated with doing, with volition. Sometimes that category is used for all the other forms of thought, but and people differ about that, but it seems like the way that it was originally used had more to do with the doing mind. So what you want to do or don't want to do about the things that you perceive, in other words, the sankhara that emerge from that, sanya. And then vijnana. So vijnana is the consciousness, the sort of basic awareness that is taking in the other four, present for the other four. And so this is a way that the Buddha is talking about the components of our experience, such that we might be able to focus on different aspects and begin to understand their relationships, how they emerge. And it might be that you think that all of the five khandhas are present at all times, particularly if you're feeling that your mind is very busy or very full of thought. But actually, it's very possible. In fact, I would say that uh, with samadhi practice, it's very possible to experience the mind without the sankhara, without the doing mind. And for this reason, then it draws in the frameworks that the Buddha gave for samadhi practice, the jhanas, and other forms of samatha, other forms of stilling the mind. In fact, also, it's possible, given those kinds of practices, to experience the mind without sanya, states of neither perception nor non-perception, or of both perception and non-perception. Dropping off the observer. But even if you're not in those kinds of deep meditative states, it's still possible to study the khandhas. And the tool that the Buddha recommended for that, or one of the practices that the Buddha recommends quite thoroughly. So just to say, the khandhas are mentioned in hundreds of discourses, not just the Untitled Sutta. In fact, in the Samyutta alone, there are over 200 discourses about the khandhas. So it was a teaching that the Buddha felt was quite important. But then again, moving on to sati, mindfulness is a way of being present for those aspects of experience. We also see, for example, in the Satipatthana Sutta and the Four Foundations of Mindfulness, these three that are left. So if we take away the sanya and the sankhara, what we have left is we have the rupa, the body, and the feeling tone, and the consciousness. Those three things, they're very closely related with contact. And similarly, when we look at the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha begins with mindfulness of the body. In particular, the one I want to point to is mindfulness of the body in activity. When you're moving your leg, when you're sitting down, when you're standing up, walking, using the bathroom. Being present for this physical experience. And then the second of the foundations of mindfulness, as many of you probably know, is feeling tone. Feeling tone. So the Buddha places a great emphasis on that. It's one of the four. And then moving to mind, different aspects, different characteristics of the mind as a whole. So the mind as clouded with greed or hatred, or the mind as very constrained, or the mind as very open, looking at the mind through different lenses. And then the Dhammas, again, more related, in some cases, in many cases, more related to the sankharas, the different volitional ways that we practice with what's happening, addressing the hindrances, for example. But these are different reasons. So we start to see how these frameworks are pointing at those three aspects of experience: the body, the feeling tone, and the consciousness that is there, the awareness that is there, present. Because mindfulness is about aligning our attention with that awareness so that there's a heightened aspect to it, there's an energetic presence to it, there's a clarity about it, and a simplicity about it. So when we look at feeling tone, which is the one that I really want to hone in on today, when we look at feeling tone, and indeed when we look at all of the five khandhas, what we see is many things, but one thing that we see is that they're unreliable, subject to change, constantly in a process. Gone before you say gone. And this is something that drives a lot of our experience, this kind of underlying feeling tone and our tendency to lean into the pleasant feeling tone and lean away from the unpleasant feeling tone and be confused about or turn away from, deny the neutral feeling tone. This is a very strong underlying tendency within our experience. So to illustrate that, I want to tell you a little story from when I was a young mom, when my daughter Kayla was young. Some of you may have heard me tell the story about the ice cream party. I used it in the past to talk a little bit about specific conditionality, but tonight I want to use it a little bit to talk about Vedana. So my daughter was having a birthday. I think it was the 3-year-old birthday. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be fun if we had a little party at her daycare? Because many of her little friends are going to be there already, and we could just sit the kids around the table and have a little party all together, and there would be less cleaning up for me, and the kids would have fun together, and she could celebrate with all of her friends from the daycare, and then we could have another little smaller party at home, maybe with the neighborhood kids. So anyway, so I thought, I worked it all out with the daycare folks, and I said, okay, I'm gonna come on the day. And so I took a half a day off of work, and after lunch I ran over to the ice cream store and I picked up a little cup of ice cream for each one of the kids in her group in the daycare. So maybe it was, 10 kids or so around the table, Kayla and 9 other kids. And so by the time I got there, they knew I was coming. So by the time I got there, all the kids were seated at the table. So it was Kayla at one end, and then it was kind of a long rectangular table, so some kids lined up on either side. And then at the opposite end of the table was this little boy who was like one of her best friends at the daycare. They were hugging buddies. Every day when I would go to pick her up, she'd give this little boy, it's too bad I can't recall his name. She might even actually. She'd give him a hug before we went home, her little buddy. So her buddy was seated at the other end of the table. And so I have this big, box full of ice cream sundaes and like some sprinkles on the side so the kids could make whatever they wanted to with their ice creams. And I started handing out ice creams, and I put one down in front of each kid. And then the preschool teacher, the daycare teacher, she comes up to me and she says, no, he can't have one. He's lactose intolerant. He can't have one. So we take it away. And the poor little guy got really upset. He started sobbing, the little guy. He was so sad because one minute he had an ice cream like everybody else, and then the next minute he didn't have an ice cream, and he was really sad about it. And so the little guy was really sad, and he started crying. And I felt terrible because it had not even occurred to me that there would be anybody who wouldn't be able to eat the ice cream. So I hadn't brought anything else. So I had a little quick chat with the preschool teacher, and she said, yeah, okay. We have these huge cookies, these very, very large cookies. And we never give the kids a whole cookie, actually. We usually give them only like a half of the size cookie. But in this case, he's so upset. Maybe I'll just give him one of these big cookies. And so we said, okay, that's a good plan. So in the meantime, the kids are chowing down, right? All the other kids are eating their ice cream. And so she goes and runs and gets him a cookie, and she puts it down in front of him, and nothing. He was not having any of it. He was not happy with the cookie. He was still crying. He wouldn't even touch the cookie. He was still really, really sad about not having an ice cream. And so, I felt really bad. The preschool teacher felt really bad. We tried to explain to him, right? He's a little boy. He's probably, I don't know whether he'd already had his 3rd birthday, but he's around that age, just before 3 or just after 3. We tried to explain to him that he couldn't have the ice cream because it would be bad for his tummy. But still wasn't really making him happy. He wasn't crying quite so hard, but he still wasn't going to eat his cookie, and he still was not really too happy. So the preschool teacher looked at me and she said, well, I don't know what else to do. Maybe one more cookie? So, so this is our last ditch effort here to make the little guy feel better. And so she ran and got another of these humongous cookies and put it down in front of him. And he looked at it and then he decided, okay. And he stopped crying and he started eating his cookie. And then he was happy. And then little by little, he got into the party and he enjoyed himself and he ate. He couldn't even eat one whole cookie. I mean, it was just enormous, this thing. Right? But the story, and the reason that I tell the story is because he was too young to he had a positive sanya, a positive vedana about the ice cream. He had a pleasant perception about ice cream. Even though the ice cream would be harmful for him, he had this pleasant perception about the ice cream. So then when he couldn't have the ice cream, he's upset. Then that's unpleasant, right? It's an unpleasant feeling. Even though that unpleasant feeling is actually off if he understood the nature of what was actually going on, the circumstances, right? And ultimately, maybe he grows up and as an adult, he has more experiences, or he is told that this isn't good for him enough, that he begins to change his feeling. Or maybe not. Maybe he always has a desire for ice cream the rest of his life. A pleasant association with ice cream, even though rationally he knows that it wouldn't be good for him. At some point he will learn that. In fact, he may already have at that age. We don't know. I don't know enough about what his home life was like to know. But he was suffering because his Vedana was different from the reality. And so, and even in having somebody tell him about the reality wasn't quite enough to overcome the way that he had been swept away. Understandably, right? He's a little boy. He's very swept away by the painful feeling of having the ice cream taken away. But what was it that actually did? So what was it that actually did make the change for him was another pleasant thing, right? Another pleasant thing that he had a pleasant Vedana for, and eventually he was willing to acknowledge that one. And that actually only works temporarily, as we come to find out. The Buddha says you can't just go on seeking pleasant feeling after pleasant feeling. That actually is also, it leads to suffering in a different way. In fact, I would say that's one of the sources of addiction, that kind of seeking after pleasant feeling. So when we begin to study our experience, our feeling tone experience, one of the things that we might find is that sometimes it aligns with our understanding of whether something is actually pleasant or unpleasant or neutral, whether it's harmful or not harmful, whether it's wholesome or unwholesome, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it doesn't. But knowing that, or at least knowing when you've been swept away and there is the perception and the sankhara and the other feelings that get the emotion and the other things that get piled onto that, then we start to understand a little bit more of the process nature of it. We start to understand how we can be pushed and pulled by this kind of reactivity to the tone, which is so oftentimes quite hidden underneath a lot of thinking about things or our history. And so if we pull back and we take an even bigger perspective, then we see the Buddha also talking about feeling when he talks about dependent causation. So bear with me because I know that these are a lot of different frameworks, and I'm not trying to have us investigate all of the frameworks at once, but rather to draw the thread of how important feeling tone is, that he brings it up again and again for us in different contexts for us to be able to understand how critical feeling tone actually is to our experience. So in the dependent causation, what happens is that the Buddha talks about, to say it very simply, sort of broadly, he talks about how, just looking at a piece of it, how when there is a consciousness and a body, then there's the ability for contact. And based on that contact, and the feeling tone arises, and there's a reaction to that feeling tone called craving. And that craving then drives the becoming and dragging us into rebirth in the next moment, rebirth in the next life. It drags us into this cycle of creating these sankhara, these actions that are based on not understanding the process. And it's at that point, he said, basically the Four Noble Truths is all about pointing us to the craving and saying, in that space between when the feeling tone arises and when the craving, so the word, that's a translation for this word tanha, which literally means thirst. So sometimes it's translated as craving or desire or just thirst, like that kind of wanting. In that space between the feeling tone, which arises out of the contact, and that response of grasping at the positive or rejecting the negative, there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity to actually break that chain. There's an opportunity for choice, for clarity. An opportunity to decide to choose a response that tends toward the end of suffering, instead of tending toward the cycle of the continuation of suffering. And it doesn't mean that wanting something like an ice cream is a bad thing. It doesn't mean that at all. It's more about the idea that getting that ice cream will make it all better. That's actually the fundamental problem. That we believe that the pleasant experience will make it all better, rather than understanding that getting unhooked from that is actually what brings peace. So the Buddha is telling us over and over again various perspectives on how to see this process working. Whether you see the process working in terms of the khandhas, so maybe you notice that you have that word avion, airplane, come to your mind, right? And maybe then you also begin to notice, oh, there's an uneasiness about that. There's an uneasiness that would tend to get acted out if it weren't for the fact that, oh, I realize it's like this now. It's an unpleasant feeling tone. Or whether you look at it from the process of, from its relationship within samadhi. So samadhi is based on using a skillful tendency to lean into the pleasant feeling tone of joy, such that the mind is willing to be present and eventually be still enough to even relinquish that kind of leaning in. Or you look at it from the perspective of the craving and the clinging that comes from the craving and the becoming that comes from the clinging, and work your way back through the chain. Causation. So many different pointers. This is why it's a very pervasive theme among the discourses. Over and over again, you see the Buddha coming up around feeling. Get to know the feeling tone. Whether it's internal or external, whether it's based on a physical experience, a bodily form of contact, or whether it's kicked off by a mental experience, so a thought that is related, a feeling tone that's related to a thought. This is how we can use a duality, actually, a sense of separation that occurs in the mind, the observer and the thought itself. So there's one part of the mind that's observing, and there's another part of the mind that's thinking, or that's having this sense of the feeling tone. And that is a it's all one mind, and yet this sense of the duality can be a skillful means, can be a way for us to start to open up that space of choice, that space of understanding, that space of stillness, of slowing down, of understanding how the components relate to each other, of the understanding the mechanism more deeply. Or it can be understanding feeling tone as sort of mundane, the Buddha said, mundane feeling tone versus a more spiritual feeling tone. A feeling tone, as I said, like in the samadhi states or in your Brahma Vihara meditations. These very, very pleasant feeling tones that can be fostered, that support your practice, that brighten the mind, that open the mind. So being aware also of how that process can arise and how it can support you. How it can bring some clarity. And finally, just returning to what the Buddha said, that this is a wondrous thing. This kind of a practice of knowing the arising, the presence, and the going away of a feeling tone. And yet, It is within our capacity as human beings. It is within our capacity. He wouldn't say it if it weren't within our capacity. So I want to leave you with a poem because I'm very much enjoying the poetry of the Terrys these days. And as some folks were mentioning, we're going to be teaching an online retreat hosted by Spirit Rock starting on the 5th of June on the Terry Gata as interpreted by Maddie Weingast in this lovely book called The First Free Women. And we have been really enjoying this, being close to the awakened women of the Buddha's time and the teachings that they gave so beautifully. And so I would like to leave you with just a little piece of a poem, actually, by Rohini. Rohini, her name means wandering star. Rohini Terry. So she was, as I said, she was one of the arahants of the Buddha's time. A woman who had completely clarified this matter. And she says this, she says, the path isn't a line on a map. The path, meaning the Noble Eightfold Path, the path to absolute liberation, path to freedom. The path is not a line on a map. It is a great shining world. Enter wherever you like. And please know that this is true in your own life. The path is not a line on a map somewhere. It is your entire great shining world. So please enter wherever you like. Thank you all for listening this evening.
Dhammaya Dhammakataya Sadhu Karaya Namaste. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
No, I think just to let everyone know that we're going to stop the recording at this